Let us listen for the word of the Lord in the book of Exodus, chapters 13 and 14. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, 'This is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt.' It shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. For with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance at its proper time from year to year." When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was closer. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light during the night, so that they might travel by both day and night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done, letting Israel out of our service?" So he had his chariots made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you when we were in Egypt, when we said, 'Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. Then the Lord said to Moses, Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, but you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go out into the sea on dry ground. The angel of God who was going before the Israelites moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. Those pillars came between the people of Egypt and the people of Israel. And so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night, and one did not come near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all throughout the night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Holy wisdom, holy words. Thanks be to God. Where are they today? The Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Hivites. Where are the people who occupied the chosen land long before the Israelites? The people who were there enjoying the milk and honey, even as God was telling Abraham to look up at the stars, to count them if he was able, to believe that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars, and that their future would be in this land that belonged to other people. Where are these people groups today, these ancient nations that once ruled the desert and its oases? Those other nations weren't weaker than the Israelites. God's chosen people didn't muscle their way into the promised land and kick those other people out, even if some of their narratives portray that they wish they could have or they believe they should have. The Israelites weren't stronger than those other people. They weren't more unified than those other people. They were constantly at war with each other, and they eventually split into two different nation states. They weren't stronger. They weren't more unified. They were constantly at war with each other. They weren't better at playing the political game because they were constantly being conquered by a succession of powerful empires who enslaved them and exiled them and tried to stamp out their culture and their religion and make them adapt to the values of the empire, but they never could. The Israelites persisted through all their infighting, all their external conflict, all the attempts to wipe them out by force or by persuasion, all of their idolatry and faithlessness and turning away from God, because despite all the conflicts in their souls and their bodies and in the world around them, there were a set of rituals and practices that held them together. There were all those Old Testament laws that we as modern Christians deride today. The bans on shellfish and pork, absurdly specific prohibitions like no boiling a baby goat in the milk of its own mother. The whole temple system and its demand for sacrifices, we deride these practices today, but in ancient times they held the people together. They reminded them of God's power in the universe, affirmed the love of God in their lives, and gave them something to cling to when the rest of the world was falling apart. Even in those moments when idols were taking over the land and the people were turning to the worship of other gods in addition to this one, those rituals were, at the very least, a set of common practices that defined them as people and made them closer to one another. Even if their beliefs in God were wavering, it was deeply ingrained in them that they don't eat pigs. They don't eat oysters. They practice a ritual with unleavened bread and wine and a set of questions passed down through the generations. They heard the stories about their ancestors and their God, even if their belief in that God wavered, and their belief in that God did often waver. The rules and rituals reminded them of who they were. So today, where are the Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and the Hivites? Those nations, those tribes, those people groups have faded into history. They assimilated into the more powerful nations who conquered them. They adopted new religions and new languages. They faded into the background and became someone else. But the Israelites, God's chosen people, managed to stay together despite all their best efforts to pull themselves apart. At the beginning of our passage this morning, we hear about a ritual. God's people have just been liberated from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. They have witnessed the power of God raining down on Egypt in the form of plagues, raining down in the form of frogs and flies and rivers turning into blood. The Pharaoh of Egypt has finally acquiesced to the demands of the God of creation, delivered through the tremulous voice of Moses, "Let my people go." And the people have gone, not by the most direct route, but in a circular route meant to confound the Egyptians. And on their way out, God stops to tell them about a ritual. Through Moses, the Lord says, Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by the strength of his hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, the first month of your new calendar, you are going out. So each year at this time, celebrate this ritual. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days, because unleavened bread is the food of escape, the food of running, the food you eat when there's no time to let the dough rise. Eat bread that is not leavened. You shall tell your child on that day, we do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. For with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Because of this ritual, because of this practice, the story will live on your body and live in your stomach and live in your mouth, through which it will be spoken. As our reading continues, the Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues the people in the desert. They have a constant reminder of the power of God in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, mysteriously leading them forward. Nonetheless, as they hear the sounds of the Egyptians getting closer and see the waves of the Red Sea looming before them, they quake in fear, somehow believing that the God who rescued them from slavery will not be here to save them in this moment. They cry out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the desert? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to persist in bondage than to die in the desert." They insist that it would have been better for them to live in slavery than to have this freedom and this fear. They insist that it would have been better for them to persist in the hard labor, to persist in the oppression, than it would have been to have freedom and this fear. How often do we as modern people choose bondage over liberation? How often do we choose to acquiesce to the voice of fear and worry, the voice that minimizes our hearts and souls, the voice that tells us we're not good enough? How often have we pulled back from doing good because we're not talented enough to do enough good to make what we think is a difference? How often have we stayed in relationships that were not life-giving, or held jobs that deprived us of our souls because the voice of fear and worry discourages any kind of change? Because the voice that minimizes us says there is not a better future out there, and God does not have more in store for you. How often have we held our church back from its future because we're clinging to the grains of desert sand slipping through our fingers in the present? Do you really believe that the things you worry about are greater than the Red Sea? Do you believe the fear you feel was greater than what the Israelites felt in that moment? Or do we just not believe the story? Do we just not believe that this happened? Or do we think that God is done with miracles, that the Lord who came through for them will not come through for us? That was a different time. That was a different place. They knew where they were supposed to go. God wouldn't do something like that for me. Later in the story, the Israelites will make their way across the desert. They will cross the Red Sea and make their way across the desert. It will take them a mere 40 days to reach the promised land. Not 40 years, just 40 days. They will get to the Jordan River and send scouts across the water to tell them about the land and their prospects in it. When the scouts return, they'll say it's a good land, but the other people there are so strong. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Hivites, they're massive. They'll overpower us. They are greater than we will ever be. Two of the scouts protested, reminding the Israelites of the God who rained down power and plagues on Egypt, the God who parted the waters of the Red Sea and led them through. But the people were too afraid. They decided not to enter the promised land. They decided there was too much to lose. God's judgment upon them was that they would wander the desert for 40 years, not because it would take 40 years to physically get where they were going, but because it would take 40 years for the faithless generation, the generation that turned aside, to die, and to make room for a new generation of Israelites, born and raised in the desert and formed by the conditions there. It would take 40 years for the generation of people who made it to the river and turned aside to pass away, to make room for a new generation, born and raised in the desert, formed by the conditions of the wilderness, to cross the river, to claim the land, to inherit the promise. Let's not let this be so for us. Let's not let this be the way God leads us. These Israelites, these people we meet from our reading, these people who witnessed the hand of God in Egypt and who will see the waves of the Red Sea held open before them, will refuse to cross the Jordan River because they refuse to believe that God will be with them upon their crossing. But when our desires are in line with God's will, when we align ourselves with God's call to love the Lord and to love our neighbors near and far, God is able to do the unimaginable. When our desires align with God's will, the will that we love God and love our neighbors near and far, God is able to do the unimaginable. So I'd like to invite you to imagine something this morning. Close your eyes and see with your mind's eye something impossible that is in line with God's love. Imagine a group of people who need help having their needs met. Imagine this church reaching hundreds of new people with a message of God's love. Imagine yourself liberated from worry and fear. Imagine one seemingly impossible thing. Take your time and imagine just one thing. Once you've seen that one thing, hold that vision close. Believe that vision. Have faith in it. Believe that God can part the waters to make it happen. And let's walk through the waters together. Amen.